Your Honour, I can now move on to Bishop Hurley. Would you tell the Royal Commission your full name?
Yes, Daniel Eugene Hurley.
And you're the Bishop of Darwin?
Yes, your microphone's not amplifying you enough.
Oh, is that better? Yes, that is better.
Yes.
Thank you. Bishop, what work did you do before becoming Bishop of Darwin?
I was the Bishop of Fort Perry Diocese prior to that, and a priest in that diocese prior to that.
Thank you. Now, you've provided two statements, one dated the 14th of October 2016.
Yes.
And the contents of that are true and correct?
Yes, they are.
And another one dated the 28th of November 2016?
Yes.
Now, Bishop, recently as the end of January last year, you put out to all parish priests and principals of primary and secondary schools in Darwin a document about the Sacrament of Reconciliation.
Yes, I did.
You're familiar with the document I'm referring to?
Yes, I am.
And as part of that document, you referred to the current practice of the Sacrament of Reconciliation in schools taking place in a communal setting in the church, full view of all the participants.
Yes.
And then you asked that it be done in a particular way. Can you describe that to us?
Well, yes, what I asked them to do in essence, Ms Finesse, was to at all times have line of sight, that there was never to be any situation where there could be any doubt about what was happening.
What prompted you to take that action last month?
Well, I think that it was a matter of giving reassurance to people, particularly people who attend our schools, who entrust us with the sacred trust of their children, that I should do everything and make sure that everybody else was doing everything that they could and should, in my opinion, to give parents absolute solace about the safety of their children, whether it was sacramentally or in the schoolyard or anywhere else.
Had any particular event been brought to your attention?
No.
I tendered that document, Your Honour.
To become Exhibit 5010.
And it's the case, I think, that what you have said to your priests in that document is consistent with canon law.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Bishop, you provided a statement in which you set out all the various policies that apply in your diocese.
Yes.
One area of difference in your diocese than perhaps others is that all people, including priests, are mandatory reporters.
Yes, anybody over 18 in the territory are mandatory reporters.
How has that affected, if at all, the work of your priests?
I'm not aware that it's affected them in any particular way, except that I expect them to take that seriously. But I'm not aware of any particular effect it's had on them.
Has there been any discussions with the Community Services Department about reporting by priests?
Community Service Department of?
Within the Northern Territory?
No, not specifically to my knowledge.
Because the mandatory reporting regime results in reports to the equivalent of a Community Services Department or Child Welfare Department.
Yes, that's true.
There hasn't been any discussions with that agency?
Not with me. No.
There haven't been any discussions among priests about whether it's onerous, not onerous, useful?
Not to my knowledge, no. It's, as I say, it's not something I think that's affected them directly. Not that I'm aware of.
You wouldn't be seeking to argue that they should be exempt from it?
Not at all.
Thank you. Now, just coming to your statement, question 2 on page 5, paragraph 16. It's in relation to complaints and settlements, and you note that the Diocesan Office had not made a settlement and that the Professional Standards Office had received very few complaints, and most of those had been referred to the relevant congregations.
Yes.
So it's the case that if a complaint is received in the Diocesan Office that affects a member of an order or congregation, you forward that to that body?
Yes, I do. There's a procedure by which that happens, but ultimately, yes.
And then you have nothing more to do with it?
Well, it's my personal policy to follow up and make sure that I have a clear understanding of what the result of that was. And my Director of Professional Standards would always give me a final, including any documentation that she might think is useful.
Do you have any formal role in relation to that complaint that's about a member of an order or congregation?
Only insofar as canon law requires me that if the person is the subject of another entity, another diocesan bishop or religious leader, that I, through my Director of Professional Standards, must see that that procedure is correctly run, and that I need to, well, I certainly do check that it has happened. I would normally contact the person to whom that now is there, that they become the authority, and make sure that there's no misunderstanding or lack of evidence or that I can supply.
Do you have an interest in the outcome?
Yes, I do.
Have you had cause to disagree with what you've been told was the outcome?
No, I haven't, not in my time there. No, I haven't. They've been satisfactory in my opinion.
Now, there's been a couple of complaints against clergy.
Yes.
And you indicate that one was not able to be progressed as the complainant had left Darwin.
Yes.
What about the priest against whom the complaint was made?
That particular priest, as I understand it, was in a state of mental disability in a nursing home at the time, and he was counselled insofar as that was a possibility, but he was really incapax, he was incapable.
And you didn't need to restrict his ministry in any way because of his circumstances?
Correct.
Now, you've indicated in one of your policies that risk assessments are conducted for diocesan activities involving children.
Yes.
Is that a recent initiative?
Well, no, it's something that I would have expected and has been part of, particularly in youth ministry, so that if they're having an immersion event in one of our communities or a weekend retreat or what, then the Director of Youth Ministry must carry out a risk assessment, and to the best of my knowledge that's always been done, and I think it's borne fruit.
In what way?
But there's never been an incident reported to me, either physical, accidents, people travelling to and fro, and or any suggestion of impropriety.
Now, you have schools within your
Yes, I do.
diocese, and I take it you have an equivalent of a Catholic education body?
Yes, we do, the Catholic Education Office, we call it.
And you also have an arm that is involved in Catholic welfare work?
Yes, Catholic Care, Northern Territory.
Has Catholic Care been audited or accredited in any way?
It has indeed. It has the highest possible accreditation, actually, which it didn't need to pursue, but did. And it's one of the few, as I understand it, throughout the nation that has that accreditation.
That's with the Australian Childhood Foundation?
Yes, as I understand it.
And it was a voluntary matter for you to seek it?
Yes, it was.
Was it sought in your time?
Yes, it was.
And what did you receive?
Well, it's an accreditation. I'm not quite sure of the details of that, but it's an accreditation that goes with the with Catholic Care Northern Territory, and I think it's meant to be an indicator to people who would trust programs to that this organisation has the highest possible accreditation in this area.
You heard the discussion, no doubt this morning, with your colleagues in relation to why the abuse that we have heard so much about occurred in the Catholic Church. What are your views on that matter?
Well, I suppose it's an evolving sense of why it happened. Miss Vanessa, I suppose my mind was focused in a different way, in a helpful way, by the tragic events that we now have a Royal Commission to in my diocese into Dondale and the juvenile prison system. It's much more than an academic exercise for me. I know those people. I washed their feet in the liturgical function during Holy Week, I go there and wash their feet. So it's not just an academic exercise for me. And when I saw the Four Corners thing, I, like many people, certainly in the Northern Territory around Australia, my profound question was, how on earth could this happen? And I've thought about that, and it's enabled me to make some comparisons, perhaps. I'm thinking through that. But it was, and I described it at the time in the media as a brutal betrayal of trust. And I stand by that. I think that's accurate. But having said that, so what? How did it happen? It's probably easier for me to suggest how it happened there than might happen in my own organisation, but it's helped me. I think it was an unscrutinised trust which should never have been given and should never be given to anybody where there are children involved. I don't think you should trust anybody. I don't think you can. I think that's a failure, to trust somebody else with your children. You've got to be able to be sure, not trust them, be sure. And as I say to my priest, you should never make people guess. They're not your children. So I don't think trust is a thing that should be easily given. If it is given, it's sacred, and any betrayal of it is awful. So that was obvious to me. It was a matter of power, because there was an enormous differentiation of power between those children and the authorities. Unbelievable. It was isolated. By its very nature, it's isolated. There was a lack of supervision. Who was supervising this whole thing? There was an acceptance of less than best practice. That was an element of it, I believe. And it was a closed shop. Who was to know? And how would we have known other than that? So I draw some parallels, I guess, in my own mind about wrestling with how could this happen in what I have given my life to, the Catholic Church. How could it happen? And I think there are many elements there that are relatable. How they relate, I think, is awkward and difficult and so on. But I think they're there, and it's certainly my intention, as you pointed out with one of those documents, to eliminate wherever we can those elements.
You've heard much discussion about clericalism.
Yes, I have.
Clericalism could be seen as relevant to more than one of the factors you've described in relation to juvenile justice.
Yes.
What role do you think it played?
It's hard to know, but I think it's played a role. I think it's almost a kind of a pathology. Being a cleric is no different from being married if you're doing it for the right reasons. And I think that pathologies develop in relationships and pathologies develop in people who are celibate. And I think that that sense of clericalism, which I think Archbishop Porteous pointed out, it's a pathology that develops rather than the thing itself. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it happens. And I think there are elements of priesthood and the attitude to priesthood that have loaned itself to this kind of, I know they call it being put on a pedestal. Well, sometimes people, you don't have to stay on the pedestal, you can get off it. There is a certain acceptance, I think, among some clergy, perhaps not modern, but there was an acceptance that it was a pretty special position. And I think it's like, in many ways, in country places where it's the doctor or the bank manager, or there were people who were educated, whatever that meant, but there were people who sat above the rest and were always given deference because it was the doctor. And so if the doctor did it, well, but if your next door neighbour did it, it was a different matter. And I think that the priesthood fitted into something of that model of being educated, being given deference because of it, because of your role rather than who you were. And I think that probably infected, I think it can infect people's character, and so they finish up misusing power and expecting things that they shouldn't expect because of some mythical role.
One of the key differences between the examples you've given and the role of the priest in a community is the priest had virtually unparalleled access to children.
Yes, so I'm not quite sure about access to children.
Well, the situation, particularly in rural or more distant
yes.
dioceses, was that the priest was often invited home,
Yes,
often helped children with their homework, were permitted in their rooms,
yes,
often had overnight activities,
yes,
had access to the children through altar service and the like.
yes,
Whereas the examples you've given, bank manager has little access, a doctor certainly would have access perhaps on a one-to-one basis, but not with anything like the frequency of a priest.
no, that's true.
If as you say, that deference and power was a factor to play in what had happened, what do you say now about what has changed about that deference and power so as to be satisfied that that has reduced the likelihood of it happening again?
I think, as I say, these are things that are evolving in my own understanding of the mystery of what's happened. But one of the things I think with this kind of clericalism goes celibacy. I think there's a connection there. And I was just saying to somebody the other day, as a young man, celibacy was not an attractive concept for me at all. So if I wanted to be a priest, I had to somehow or another wrestle with what's the point of that. Because I think if you ever accepted celibacy because you didn't like women or you didn't want to be committed in a love relationship, I think there's something pathological about that. So I had to work out some way in which, in my own mind, celibacy was a useful thing. And I came to the conclusion during my seminary training that the only way that celibacy would be life-giving for me is that if it was a total and complete commitment of love that I would make if I was marrying a woman and the family that I would hope to have, that I would make that total commitment as love is to the other. And that for me, the other had to be the people I was called to serve. And I think that if you see celibacy, well, I see celibacy as a total availability, as a total service to the other, without response, if necessary. That's their business, but my commitment is to them, as it would be in a love relationship with another person. I think then that celibacy is life-giving, it's joyful, it's meaningful. But I think if it's just a negative thing, I think that it breaks into that world of clericalism because it's a negative, it can be depressive. I think people have a sense of missing out. And so I think the concept of celibacy for me is almost key, one of the keys in trying to deal with the clericalism concept.
Well, that's not going to change anytime soon, is it?
Which one?
The fact of the celibacy.
No, presumably not. But I think you can have a change of attitude to if you're going to take it on, how are you going to manage it? What does it mean for you?
So in terms of my question about what is being done now in relation to clericalism, described as a deference
Yes.
power relationship, you've answered it with respect to celibacy being a positive element.
Part of it, yeah.
And part of it, and celibacy hasn't changed from then to now. So what is it that you point to say we have changed this in order to give comfort to people that what happened before won't happen again?
Yeah, I think that certainly in my own diocese we would have very strict safeguards around, like in our, each parish has safeguards officers, some have more than one. In my relationship with the clergy, we would over and over and over again at almost every deanery meeting, every clergy conference, every consultants meeting, every council of priests meeting, bring the matter up and explain, particularly to people who might be new to our country, that we're at the service of people and availability is a key. Absolute key. If in the middle of the night, middle of the day, early, late, you're there at the service of people. And I think what I'm trying to do anyway is, it's not perhaps just attack clericalism, but saying, the true role of a priest is to be at the service of others. And I think if we can get that, the other elements that develop into what we're now terming clericalism and are unfortunate, I think that's the best way of excluding them. I hope so.
You say that your thoughts are evolving.
Yes.
You know that the Church created its first procedures 20 years ago.
Yes, I do.
And prior to that, there were complaints coming in and the issue was known because of Boston and the like. Why is it that your thoughts are evolving to the extent that the Church, and you as a member of the Church, finds it difficult to explain in concrete terms what happened and why?
I'm not sure. I simply don't know why it happened and why, I have elements of the matter I referred to with the matter in the Northern Territory. I'm not close to that, but I imagine that there's all sorts of questions in their minds now about how it could happen. And clericalism may be one of them. Isolation is another. Bad formation could be one. Certainly character dysfunction, certainly one. So all of those things, I think, are elements in it. But it would be, for me, facile to suggest this is what happened and that's how it occurred. I don't think, in my own mind and heart, it's not as easy as that. It's complicated, it's convoluted, and my evolving thinking, I hope, is informed by good research, by revelations of people who've been abused and others who've been helped through that into a new place and now have a new understanding to help me. So that's why I'd say it's evolving. I don't want to come to some sort of facile conclusion. I want to be open to understanding anything and everything about it in the best possible way with the best possible brains helping.
Towards Healing is applied in your diocese?
Yes, it is.
As part of Towards Healing, there's often a meeting between the survivor and somebody from the Church.
Yes.
Who routinely attends that meeting in your diocese?
Yeah. There hasn't been a case for us to do that. I've done it previously in another place.
In Port Pirie?
Yes.
And in Port Pirie, who attended?
I did.
As the Bishop of Port Pirie?
Yes.
Did you experience from that meeting any revelations in relation to child sexual abuse by clergy?
Yes, I think that probably for all of us, I imagine the first thing that you experience is absolute heartbreak, to see the pain and the devastation that it causes to people, not only to the people themselves, but to their other relationships, which is tragic. And there's a difference, I think, in my own life anyway, of reading about something or reading a report and sitting down eyeball to eyeball with somebody because it sears it into, it's an experience. It's not just information, it's an experience. And I must say I'm very grateful for that, not because it happened, but because I'm different because of it. And one of the lovely things for me, and it may not be very universal, one of the lovely things for me is that on several occasions we were able to work through, with their help, to a very good place. And I'm not saying that because I thought it was a good place, but because that's the response of the people that were involved. So I found it wasn't always the best experience, and it didn't always work the way I wanted, but on many occasions it did, and it helped me an enormous amount.
Thank you. Coming back to your statement, you were asked some questions about priests from overseas and
Yes.
how that was dealt with.
Yes.
And at paragraph 37 of your statement, you say that you have an understanding of the need to enculturate priests that come from overseas, and you provide an example of a priest from Tanzania.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes, he's a very fine person, but if I could digress just for a moment about that particular priest, and I suppose it's relevant. He had never been out of Tanzania. He'd never been on a plane, and he came from Morogoro to Dar es Salaam to Darwin, and which was an enormous exercise for him. And within 2 days, his mother, whom he had left in good health, died suddenly. And I suppose it's in the context of this that I said to him, well, you must go home. And he said, no, my family would not expect me to come home now that I've just been here. I said, yes, but, you know, your bishop will expect you to go home. And he said, my bishop would expect me not to go home because I've just come here. Until finally I said, well, actually, I'm your bishop, and I want you on the plane tomorrow. And so we did that. And it's been one of those exercises, again, which you'd think you ought to have done. But in talking with him, it's been so important that he was there for that and not go home on leave 6 months later and people tell him about it. And it was lovely, another priest from India who came and was not long with us, similar thing happened. And I got this man from Tanzania in, I said, can you talk to this man about the need to go home? And so that kind of gelled for me the way that we could induct them into the culture of Australia. And that was part of it. But I also said to this man from Tanzania, I want you to come to Sydney and do a course, which he did and found really, really helpful. And I said, now, when you come back, you've got to talk to all the rest of the priests and tell them what you learned and what was different and what they should look out for and so on. So I think that's been a good, and we've had other priests go through that. But I think for him, it stood out for me as a very useful exercise. It's not watertight, and I think he still struggles with the authority figure. For him, you know, to disagree or to indicate you might disagree with a person in authority is not his culture. And I've tried to say to him, in our culture, you're not being indifferent or rude. You know, if you've got something to say, you say it in a respectful way, but you say it, and that's what I expect, and that's what other people in authority expect of you, to give your opinion. But if he had a contra opinion, he told me he would find it really difficult to express it to his superior. So that's been helpful to me too, and helpful to me in talking with all the priests about what I'd call enculturation. I think they call it acculturation and a few other things now. But how do you manage your life as a priest from overseas in an Australian context? And particularly in my diocese, Miss Vanessa, we've got a third of my diocese Aboriginal people and communities. Marvellous, beautiful people who talk different languages and so on. We also have about 82 different nationalities. And so these priests are much more at home in a way in my diocese than they are in other places sometimes, because there's a community where they feel safe and people within that community whom they trust and respect who could say, look, you can't do that, you know, that's not what we do here in Australia. So I suppose that's a long answer to your question, but it's how we're trying to do it.
You say that the course that he and others have done in Sydney went well.
Yes.
Are you able to test that or measure that in any way other than your discussions with them on their return?
No, probably not. I don't know. I don't have access. I mean, I could get it, I think, but when I say I don't have access, I've not followed up access to any evaluation of those courses. They're generally regarded as very good, and so that's as far as I've gone. I've not seen any evaluation, a technical, scientific evaluation of them.
You say you have a very diverse community.
Yes.
In Darwin.
Yes.
How does that affect, if at all, the work you're doing in safeguarding?
In many ways, I think it makes it easier, and in many other ways, it makes it more difficult. Because I'm not quite sure myself how best to relate to some cultures. I do my best. I try my best by having people within those various cultural groups that I know and trust, and they are open with me about telling me what's right and wrong, particularly our Indigenous communities. But the easy way, I think, is that many of our communities, it's very high on their, the protection of children is a very high priority. So that helps. But I think in some of our other communities, I'm just not terribly familiar with how best to inculcate what I want, other than to say it. And we have, I introduced a magazine that a diocese magazine. Now, pretty much every issue has articles in that on from our Director of Professional Standards, our Integrity Officer, or me, or all of us, around what to do, the importance of it, what does it look like. So we're constantly getting it into situations, but I'm not quite sure how to evaluate the various communities and how effective I'm being. I'm not sure how to do that.
But you're satisfied from the feedback you get and the work that you're doing that you think it's making a difference?
Yes, I do.
You say?
Sorry if I may, Ms Finesse. There's a question that arises from what you've just said. We are indeed a multicultural society.
Yes.
I can give you two examples in my state of Port Hedland and Katanning, both rural towns, which have between 50 and 60 different nationalities each.
Yes.
So it's a common feature of Australian society. The church can't do the job of child protection on its own, which means that children need education about what's right or wrong or possible with their bodies, parents and the community. What are you doing, given what you said earlier about important not to over-trust? I don't think you use that word, but you know what I mean, to over-trust individuals. What are you doing to communicate to the various communities what their expectations of the priests should be?
Commissioner, I suppose the main thing, the first thing we'd be doing is instructing the priests and whatnot to do that work. But we also have safeguarding officers in each parish, and they're appointed by me. They report back to the integrity officer. I was just in Alice Springs Thursday, whatever, and just by accident I ran into this gentleman who said, "Look, can you have a look at this for me? Because the three of us are at Mass on Sunday doing a PowerPoint presentation on, our annual PowerPoint presentation on our role as safeguarding officers and what we expect of everybody and what they can expect of us, what their responsibilities are. Can you have a look at it for me?" So I think that as best I'm able, I'm working on the grounds that I don't want to have anybody just on trust. I want to make sure that as best I'm able, they're reporting facts, that they are in touch with people who've got questions, that they're constantly reviewing what they're doing, and that I'm constantly reviewing what they're doing. So I suppose there is ultimately some element of trust around that you trust the families with their children, and that's probably not unfair.
How do the children and the parents and the broader local community of all these various demographic groups you talk about, how do they know what rules you have set for priests, which they should be aware of and themselves follow?
Well, we've got one of the, I have it here, but one of the things that would go on the overhead, for instance, and in our magazine, is exactly what they can expect and what safeguards there are and what elements of safety for their child is being observed and must be observed, and if it's not, what they are meant to do.
Just returning to priests from overseas for a moment. You say in your statement that the diocese has a policy of not accepting overseas seminarians.
Yes.
So I take it from that you accept priests who have been ordained.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, it's a personal thing, Ms. Finesse. I'm uncomfortable, I suppose, going back in a way. I hadn't thought of it until now, but perhaps I don't want to trust other seminaries that I know nothing about, as it were, to present me with priests that I want to work with my people. And so and other bishops do different things, but I do not do that specifically for that reason, that I feel much more comfortable, and this is what we do. We invite priests from overseas, but I will either know the bishop very well or the vicar general. I would normally go, or the vicar general would go and interview those people in their place, where you've got an opportunity to listen to them, to see how they react, to ask others about them, to look at any records that you might want to look at. And that way I feel that, and then they're on a contract, maybe a 4-year contract. I feel that I can manage that much better, and if I'm uncomfortable about anything about that, to the point that it's not being resolved, I would ask the bishop to take them back. But if I have a seminarian from overseas that trains here and becomes part of my diocese, well then he's part of the diocese forever till he dies. And I, as the bishop, want to be sure as best I can that he's going to be a good priest in our diocese hopefully without any problems.
Have you sent anyone back?
No. And I hope that that's a tribute to our preparation of people coming. I hope it is.
You will understand that the Commonwealth has announced a redress scheme following the Royal Commission's recommendation. Have you formed a view as to whether or not your diocese should opt in to that scheme?
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely imperative that we have a independent national redress system, from the point of view that A, it's whatever it is, but B, and for me the most important thing about it, is that it takes that whole redress thing out of the pastoral approach to victims. And the one thing that I've found incredibly frustrating is that the pastoral aspect of a mediation can go well until somebody intervenes, and then there's litigation and all of that, so that those two things then clash. And it's heartbreaking when you see somebody taken out of that whole pastoral context on the grounds of that you can't meet a quite ambit claim, and then it goes through and you are cut out of that because you write to the person, you get a letter back from their legal representative saying all correspondence will come through me. And I just think that if we can have an independent national redress scheme, that's out of the way. I'm left then with saying, well, I'm sorry it wasn't more, or I'm glad it was, or whatever it is, but that's not my business. My business is with you. And now how can you and I work through this thing? You argue with them about that. And it would be just wonderful, I think. I think it's imperative if we're to deal with this business. It's imperative.
Thank you. Can I move to you, Bishop Long? Would you tell the Royal Commission your full name?
My name is Vincent Long Van Nguyen.
And you're the Bishop of the Diocese of Parramatta?
Yes.
What did you do before your appointment in Parramatta?
I was an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne for nearly 5 years, from June 2011 till my appointment to Parramatta, which was in June last year.
When were you ordained?
I was ordained an auxiliary bishop on the 26th of June 2011.
And as a priest?
As a priest, I was ordained in December 1989, also in Melbourne.
In Melbourne. So you've only worked in Melbourne before you've come to Parramatta?
No, I had worked in a number of places. I am a Franciscan, a religious, and So I did my initial training in Wollongong and then in Sydney. Then I went to the seminary to study theology for 5 years in Melbourne, where I was ordained. And then subsequent to that, I had a range of or a number of appointments, including assistant priest in various parishes in Melbourne. And I did 2 stints in Rome, initially as a student, a postgraduate student, for 2 years, and in 2008, 2011, for nearly 3 years, I worked at the international leadership team of my order in Rome.
Thank you. Now, I think you have the status of being the first bishop of Vietnamese background, is that right?
In Australia.
Yes.
Yes.
And you were born in Vietnam?
I was born in Vietnam. I was a boat person in 1980, and I transited in Malaysia. I stayed in a refugee camp for 16 months before I came to Australia.
How old were you when you came to Australia?
I was 1 day short of my 20th birthday. That was in December 1981.
Thank you. And you soon after went into a seminary here, or you had been involved before?
Well, I was in a minor seminary in Vietnam, which was still in operation prior to the communist takeover. So I was trained as a minor seminarian, but in a diocesan jurisdiction, not a religious institute.
In your diocese, do you receive applications or approaches from priests overseas, including Vietnam, to come to your diocese?
Not from Vietnam, but from other countries, especially from India. We have a number of mostly religious priests who applied to minister in our diocese, and some of them were accepted, and so we have some overseas-born priests working in our diocese.
You heard Bishop Hurley's evidence about not accepting seminarians and accepting only those who have been ordained elsewhere and following a process of interview and the like. Do you follow any similar process?
No. The fact is that we do have some, not a great number, of overseas-born seminarians. And we apply a very robust system of screening and monitoring in order to ensure that these overseas, these candidates who were sourced from overseas were fit for our diocese.
Do you use the facilities Bishop Hurley referred to in Sydney?
No, we have our own seminary. In fact, only last Sunday, I blessed and opened our new seminary called the Holy Spirit Seminary in our own diocese.
By opening that, do we take it that you have a sufficient number of priests coming forward to require a new seminary?
Yes, well, in fact, we have had our own seminary for a number of years, even before I came into the diocese. They were housed in different locations because we didn't have the facility to accommodate all of them. we were able to build our own seminary, and thankfully we have a large number of native-born, homegrown candidates, in addition to some who are overseas born.
The Royal Commission has heard a deal of evidence about the diminishing numbers of young men coming forward to be a priest or religious. That's not your experience in your diocese?
I think there is also a reduction in the number of candidates coming forward. I think it's a universal phenomenon. We have seminarians. The latest count is 16, but that's in no way sufficient in terms of the replacement rate. So I wouldn't say that we buck the trend as such, although thankfully we, in comparison to other jurisdictions, certainly to similar size dioceses in Australia, we have a number of, we have more candidates to the priesthood.
You'll have heard evidence this morning about some seminarians in some seminaries wishing to adopt a more traditional approach to wearing the garb and etc. Is that an experience that you've had?
It is my concern that there is a trend, not only in certain seminaries in Australia, but I think it's a byproduct of the two pontificates before that of Pope Francis, which encouraged a certain restoration, you might say, of the traditional model of church, and therefore the seminarians who were trained in that period, I would say, were byproducts of that kind of culture in the church.
You've also heard evidence that clericalism has been described as a factor or playing a role in the abuse of children and the response to that abuse, and the connection between the deference and power that is part of clericalism and the more traditional approach of some seminarians. Now, do you see it like that?
I do, and I see the clericalism as a byproduct of a certain model of church, informed or underpinned or sustained by a certain theology. I mean, it's no secret that we have been operating at least under the two previous pontificates, from what I describe as a perfect society model, where there is a neat, almost divinely inspired pecking order, and that pecking order is heavily tilted towards the ordained. So you have the Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, religious, consecrated men and women, and the laity right at the bottom of the pyramid. And I think we need to dismantle that model of church. If I could use the biblical image of wineskins, it's an old wineskins that are no longer relevant, no longer able to contain the wine, if you like, and I think we need to really examine seriously that kind of model of church where it promotes the superiority of the ordained, and it facilitates that power imbalance between the ordained and the non-ordained, which in turn facilitates that attitude of clericalism, if you like. You know, I come from a very high power distance index culture, and by that I mean a culture where the lower ranked individuals not only accept but expect that power is distributed unequally among its citizens. You know, and you know, even to this day, to this very day, a parish priest can unilaterally excommunicate his parishioners, even though he mightn't have the canonical power to do so. But in practice, that's what's happening. And I shudder to think of the risk that children and vulnerable adults, vulnerable individuals are exposed to in that kind of environment. And it's still, you know, it's still the experience in those countries. And I think you know, there's a link between compulsory or mandatory celibacy and clericalism, in that compulsory celibacy is an act of setting apart the ordained. It's creating that power distance between the ordained and the non-ordained, and so insofar as it is an instrument of subjugation or subservience, if you like, of the laity, it is wrong, and it has to be reviewed. It has to be looked at, I think, very seriously. You know, again, my culture, my home culture, the parishioners, the faithful, address the priest as father, as they do across the world, but except that the form of address on the part of the non-ordained is a bit more drastic, in that if you, who are a non-ordained person, address me as a priest, you have to use a certain personal form of address that identifies you as a subservient, as a lower-ranking person, you know, like a daughter, or you know. So it's very. So I would say that in order to dismantle clericalism, we need to look at also the issue of you know, examination and maybe abolition of those honorific titles, privileges, and institutional dynamics, if you like, that sort of breed clerical superiority and elitism. You know, people still address me, especially the faithful Catholics, you know, as your lordship, and I sort of cringe at that. Or when they come to see me, they come to meet me, they kiss my ring. You know, I'm not very comfortable with those sort of practices, because because they encourage a certain infantilization of the laity and that creation of the power distance between the ordained and the non-ordained. And I think we've got to look at these things seriously.
Have you observed any change in that area towards being more relaxed?
I think Pope Francis is certainly leading the way in that direction, and whether or not it's been filtered down the ranks, I'm not quite certain. For my part, I know that, or I feel that, especially as a bishop, I need to lead the way in promoting a church as a communal, as a discipleship of equals, and that emphasize relationships rather than power, and I feel that that's where we should be headed to.
Bishop, you provide a striking description of what you see as the situation of the church, but we just ask the others. Archbishop Prowse, do you share the bishop's understanding of the church and how it might need to change?
Yes, I resonated with quite a lot of Bishop Long's statements, and particularly, I try to accept people where they are. When they greet me in the way that they are comfortable with, but particularly with the honorifics, it can encourage an infantilization. And I do believe, though, that but when they call the priest father, for instance, it's not just an honorific. For many of them, it sort of indicates who he is in their spiritual life and who they are before God. So there's a spiritual dimension there too. So there's a certain nuance there. I wouldn't demand being called these honorifics, but if it happens, I would accept the people the way they offer that to me.
Archbishop Porteous, do you share the bishop's perception of the state of the church, as it were?
I certainly think that it's very important, and something that's very to my own heart is that priests and bishops are close to people, and that we are not seen as distant or seen in, as Bishop Long was saying, in some kind of exalted position. Certainly my own efforts as priest and as bishop has always been to try to build fraternal relationships with people. See, there's brothers. I've often would use the word my brothers and sisters rather than the father-son kind of distinction. So my attitude is always try to be to foster this sense of we are together because we have a common dignity in the fact that we're all baptised Christians. We're Christians first, and we share a common journey of faith together. That's fundamentally the attitude that I try to live and try to promote.
Would you encourage people to call you Julian?
I wouldn't encourage it. I don't object to it.
Well, just a way of understanding how you see yourself.
Sure. I think generally there's been a tradition in my own archdiocese where I received the title Your Grace. Sometimes people say Archbishop, and sometimes people will say Julian. I never insist or demand on any of those titles, but I also don't promote one against the other. Leave it to people's own, because people also have certain approaches themselves. I don't think it's necessarily a matter of subservience. They just give respect to the office, and so I appreciate that as well.
I think what Bishop Long's saying is that the problems he sees in this kind of called structural culture, if they're going to change, be removed, it'll require the clergy to do the removing, not the laity. You understand? Yeah,
no, and I would agree. I think it's important that priests have the right attitudes towards their relationship with people in the church.
Bishop Hurley, do you have any comments on what Bishop?
No, I generally agree with that. The only thing is I think you've got to not dishonour people's own culture, I don't want to dictate to them this is wrong. If they greet me in a certain way where they're comfortable and find that that's helpful to them, I would never want them to feel that they had to sort of grovel or something, even if that were their culture. But if they want to show respect to the office, one of the things I do regularly is stand in the back of the cathedral at one of the other masses, just in an open neck shirt, and people are pushing past me to get out, and if I didn't move, they'd run over me, I think. And then I come back in, an hour later with all my bishop's accoutrements, and people want to kiss your hand. What it reminds me of is that they're not doing it to me, they're honouring the office. And providing that's what they're doing, I'm much more comfortable, and as I say, I actually experience it deliberately to remind myself it's nothing to do with you, and it's the office that you are inhabiting. And I never want to say to people, I don't want you to call me whatever. I tend to be comfortable with whatever they want to call me. Some people would call me Eugene, some people call me Bishop Eugene. Many people call me Father, who've known me for a long time, and personally I like the title Father from the point of view that it reminds me that that's my role, to care and give myself for others. And I hope it reminds me too that they're investing a lot of trust in me.
Bishop, some people might say that in you identifying the respect paid to the office, that's the very problem that clericalism is all about.
Yes, I understand that, but I would put it in the context of most people I know that have friendship and even familiarity with their own doctor. When they go to see him, they'd always refer to him as, well, good morning, Dr. John, or on the golf course they might call him John, but it's just a recognition that you're going to him in a professional capacity, if you like, and you're recognising that, and you're not wanting, you're perhaps reminding him that you want him to have a professional attitude to you too with regard to confidentiality and so forth, that you're not playing golf with him, you're there for a clinical appointment, and you're perhaps making the difference by recognising that he's your doctor today and he's your golfing partner tomorrow.
You two bishops don't feel left out. We'll come back to you on these issues.
But surely, can I just take it to a more significant level, and that is, if we do believe in a discipleship of equals, which was in many sense fundamental to the Second Vatican Council's teachings, the rubber hits the roads when you're prepared to share governance arrangements equally both at parish and at diocesan level, doesn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, what we call each other in any of the church environments we've spoken to is one thing, but isn't what we've heard in the last couple of weeks calling into question the commitment of many leaders in church, both at parish and diocesan level, the willingness to actually embrace a shared governance model between men and women, priest and religious alike, without affecting the canon law as it is for the moment? Isn't that really the difficulty? And I was wondering, Bishop Vincent, is it the point that you get to, that if you believe in what you've just said about the discipleship of equals, there is a need to look at the governance arrangements within parishes and dioceses that we currently operate under?
Yes, Commissioner, I do believe that the marginalisation of women and the laity is part of this culture of clericalism that contributes not insignificantly to the abuse, sexual abuse crisis. And I think if we are serious about reform, this is one of the areas that we need to look at. I mean, accountability in that perfect church model only works upwards. You know, you're only accountable to the person above you. You know, as long as the bishop has the backing of the Pope, he's safe. As long as the priest has the backing of his bishop, he's safe. there's no accountability that reaches outwards or downwards, and that's the critical problem as far as I see. And that discipleship of equals calls into question that upward accountability that is in operation as a result of that ecclesiastical model of a perfect society, where everyone knows their place and the pecking order is strictly dictated by ordination. And so, the laity have no meaningful or direct participation in the appointment, supervision, and even removal of the parish priest. And I think that needs to change, or even at the episcopal level, the appointment, supervision, and removal of a bishop is virtually excluded from the faithful. I mean, the Morris affair is a typical example of that. There's no accountability to the faithful there, So that needs to be examined if we are serious about creating a new culture of accountability in the church today.
Could I just extend one step further? I'm mindful of the time. Would it not have served the church well had parishes and dioceses adopted that which was sought to be adopted after Vatican Council, that is, parish councils and pastoral councils, which may have in fact informed and kept informed the leaders of the church as to what was going on, and also assisted in the way in which they might have responded to those claims. And so it's not just about accountability to the faithful. Isn't one of the missing links today and in the past the absence of a robust governance arrangement, including the laity, which would have in fact enabled the leaders to understand what was going on and give guidance as to how to respond? And is that still a problem within the modern church?
I think it is, Commissioner. I think it is still a problem within the church. I mean, a parish priest, even today, can unilaterally dismiss the parish council. And many did. Many have. To me, that's the glaring gap that we need to re-examine seriously. And really, what do we do in terms of empowering the people? What do we do in terms of addressing the power imbalance between the ordained and unordained? What do we do about the full participation of the faithful and women in particular in the governance structures of the church? I mean, I think these are serious issues that need to be addressed if we are to come clean of this abuse crisis, because it's not just the symptoms on the surface, but what lies underneath it. And I think it's harder to address what lies underneath the phenomenon than addressing what's on the surface.
Yes, Bishop, thank you. We'll take lunch.
All stand.